Well, the Washington Post is reporting that the Pentagon has ordered about 1,500 active duty soldiers, quote, to prepare for a possible deployment to Minnesota. This, of course, comes after weeks of civil unrest, various protests, some of them violent, as well as the death of one woman named Renee Good. In response to that, President Trump has repeatedly threatened to invoke what's called the Insurrection Act. But a lot of people don't actually understand what the Insurrection Act is, at least insofar as it concerns the tone with which it's been covered in the mainstream news. The Insurrection Act is really one of the most controversial laws in the U.S. Code right now. In reality, it's 3 statutes that comprise a singular concept. The concepts of the law date back to 1792 and have been added to over the years until it reached its final form in 1871. There are basically 3 statutes that we need to look at to understand the law. The first is called Federal Aid for State Governments, and it reads, quote, whenever there is an insurrection in any state against its government, the president may, upon the request of its legislature or of its governor, if the legislature cannot be convened, call into federal service such of the militia of the other states in the number requested by that state, and use such of the armed forces as he considers necessary. This statute does not necessarily pertain quite as much to the Minneapolis situation. However, it is important to define what exactly an insurrection is. Oxford Dictionary defines it as, quote, a violent uprising against an authority or government. And the invocation of such a law really rests on whether or not the Trump administration decides that that is what is going on in Minneapolis. The second statute reads, whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages, or rebellion against the authority of the United States make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the United States in any state by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, he may call into federal service such of the militia of any state and use such of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or to suppress the rebellion. So the implementation of this law hinges on whether those protesting and in some cases assaulting members of federal law enforcement are causing unlawful obstructions, assemblages, or rebellions, as it says in the statute. Another notable clause that you'll probably hear in the weeks and months to come if such a law is invoked is whenever the president considers, which places the authority for the decision of whether to deploy federal troops entirely in the president's hands. He does not have to consult Congress, and he may use the amount of force that, quote, he considers necessary to enforce those laws. One of the criticisms of this law is that it's overly broad and grants the president too many powers. However, as we'll talk about in a moment, it has been used for good things over the course of the decades and centuries that it's been in place. The third statute is called Interference with State and Federal Law. It's a little bit lengthy, so we'll read the most pertinent sections. The president, quote, by using the militia or the armed forces or both, or by any other means, shall take such measures as he considers necessary, there's that phrase again, to suppress in a state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy, if it either so hinders the executions of the laws of that state and of the United States within that state that any part or class of its people is deprived of a right, privilege, immunity, or protection named in the Constitution. In other words, if a protest is blocking someone from gaining access to something that they are constitutionally allowed to do, like entering a church or going to a school, which is the example that we'll talk about in a moment, then the president is allowed to use the forces of the U.S. military to protect that constitutional right. The other situation under which he is allowed to invoke the Insurrection Act is if a protest or assembly, quote, opposes or obstructs the execution of the laws of the United States or impedes the course of justice under those laws. Now, what you would probably hear from the White House if they were to invoke such a law is that the protesters are, say, blocking ICE agents as they are attempting to conduct lawful deportation operations, and so they are allowed to invoke the Insurrection Act and use, say, the U.S. Army in this case, to control crowds and protect the ability of those agents to do their jobs. And even as the Insurrection Act is proving quite controversial in the earliest months of 2026, it's actually been invoked about 30 times throughout its history to kind of varying degrees of success. Today, some of the loudest voices against the Insurrection Act come from kind of the left-hand side of the American political aisle. However, the law has actually been invoked several times by notable Democrats in the past. For example, John F. Kennedy used the law to protect black students attempting to attend desegregated schools. On top of that, President Lyndon B. Johnson used it to protect civil rights advocates in Alabama during the 1960s. Ulysses S. Grant, after the Civil War, used it to fight violence caused by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s. Still, some historians do not look at all invocations of the law favorably. Some believe that the usage of the law by people like Andrew Jackson and Rutherford B. Hayes was unjust, as it was used to quell labor disputes. And some have argued that it was used unjustly to benefit the business owners against the interests of lower-wage workers. The law was used most recently in 1992 when the governor of California requested federal troops to stop the riots following the partial acquittal of several police officers involved in the beating of a black man named Rodney King. Trump has also had his eye on this law for quite a while. During his first term, some of his Republican allies in Congress, like Senator Tom Cotton, urged him to use it to stop looting and destruction following the death of George Floyd in 2020. And even legal scholars who believe that if Donald Trump was to invoke the law in Minnesota, that it would be immoral or unright, largely admit that the law is quite broad and that his use of it would be protected and legal. A Supreme Court case in 1827 ruled that, quote, the authority to decide whether an incident requiring use of the military has arisen belongs exclusively to the president, and his decision is conclusive upon all other persons. There's been some conflation of the law with the concept of martial law. Martial law has been invoked several times in the United States, but it's still kind of an ill-defined concept. It's generally agreed that martial law is when the military takes over the duties of a civilian government. However, the Insurrection Act is quite the opposite, actually. It's used to assist law enforcement agencies, not take over their duties. In Minnesota, what this would mean is that the military assists ICE rather than taking over their duties. You might recall that Trump deployed the National Guard to states including California, Oregon, and Chicago. He was able to do this by utilizing an obscure law known as 10 U.S. Code Section 12406, which allows the deployment of the National Guard when, quote, the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. With this most recent Washington Post article, if the information is correct, it seems that he's not quite as interested in invoking that law again. His deployment of National Guard troops to several cities have been blocked by district judges who oversee only a small region of the United States through a process known as preliminary injunctions, which are quite controversial, but that's a different video. So will Donald Trump invoke the Insurrection Act? I would say it's pretty much a toss-up. The Pentagon spokesman, a man named Sean Parnell, made a statement in which he was kind of cagey about that possibility. He said, quote, the Pentagon is always prepared to execute the orders of the commander-in-chief if called upon, but he didn't give any solid plans for when such a deployment might happen. Jacob Frey, who's the mayor of Minneapolis, told CNN that he, in so many words, believes that the Pentagon is attempting to purposely agitate the situation to create a pretext for sending the army in and invoking the Insurrection Act. He said, quote, we're not going to give them an excuse to do the thing that clearly they're trying to set up to do right now, which is these 1,500 troops. I never thought in a million years that we would be invaded by our own federal government. Both Frey, the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, and other politicians in the area have framed the invocation of the Insurrection Act, if it were to happen, as unjust, or as the Minnesota Attorney General named Keith Ellison said, a federal invasion. However, even as this is a very controversial topic and there are a lot of different voices with varying opinions, as we examine the actual underlying law that would allow Donald Trump to do such a thing, we can see that it's quite permissive, and if he were to invoke the Insurrection Act, there's not a lot that those against it could do.